Thank you very much, David. It's a real pleasure to be here. We've got a video first. Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen now. Somebody asked if the video was available, but it's on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and you type in British Antarctic Survey Extreme Antarctica, then you should be able to find the video. So I'm going to talk tonight about Antarctica and the impact of global warming on Antarctica. But I have to say, as Dave said, I'm a paleobotanist, and so I can't resist showing you and starting with a few fossils. So what I'm going to do is show you a bit about what Antarctica was like in the past when it was warm previously, millions of years ago, then move on to where it's cold now, and then perhaps come back to a warmer climate in the future. So here's a satellite image of Antarctica covered in ice. 99.9% of it is covered in ice, some of it up to 4 meters thick and 4 kilometers thick. And the really key thing to understand is if all that ice melted, global sea levels would rise by about 50 to 60 meters. Of course, by then, all the other kind of ice on the globe would have also melted. So that's really the main big influence of Antarctica on the rest of the world. It holds, a huge percentage, 70% of the world's fresh water. And if that then comes off of Antarctica into the oceans, it's going to have a massive global impact. So how do we get there? Are we going to that kind of place? It is a very beautiful place at the moment. I mean, it's in a fantastic frozen state. It is the most beautiful place I've ever been, hauntingly beautiful at times, but sometimes not at others. So this is my field camp on Seymour Island, which is a small island to the east of the peninsula. And when you're a geologist and you need to look for rocks and fossils, snow is your worst enemy, because if it snows like this, then there'll be me and a field assistant in my tent, probably listening to music, eating food, playing cards or dice or something like that, and then sleeping a lot. So I'm probably waiting a couple of days for the snow to melt. But Antarctica wasn't always covered in snow and ice. And millions of years ago, there were forests on Antarctica. And so I'm just going to start by showing you a few fossils, just to show you what Antarctica was like in the past. And also, it does help us more and more actually these days, what Antarctica will be like in the future, potentially, as the climate warms. So you may be surprised to know that actually although there's a very small percentage of rock in Antarctica. It's just on mountain tops and on some sea cliffs and some islands around the tip of the peninsula, which is that thumb-like projection that points up towards Chile. Actually, fossil plants, particularly fossil trees and some leaves, are quite common on Antarctica. That's because quite a lot of the rock sequences around Antarctica are actually rocks that formed on land millions of years ago. And so they've captured the fossil plants in the rock sequences. So there's plenty of work to work on, particularly around the Antarctic Peninsula region. Now, the one thing that I really do want you to take away with you, though, is that we're going to go back about 100 million years. So that's the time of the dinosaurs. And we had dinosaurs in the forests in Antarctica. We have all the fossil evidence. And people normally say to me, well, that means that Antarctica was near the equator, was it? And the climate was warm. And that's not the case at all. So this is what we call a paleogeography reconstruction. Geologists have put together a map of what the continents would have looked like 100 million years ago. And you can recognize roughly where the continents, the shapes of the continents now, they're just moved in slightly different positions. But Antarctica is down here, it's down over the South Pole. So 100 million years ago, Antarctica was over the South Pole. So if it had a climate like today, it would have had an ice cover. But instead, we've got fossil plants and dinosaurs in Antarctica. And this is what the place that I've worked on most looks like. So this is Seymour Island. It's a very unusual island. It has no ice cap. And a lot of these sediments you can see here, they look, it looks like they're Sahara. And in fact, you know, it's just, it's sediments, they're 100 million years old. They formed on the bottom of the seabed 100 million years ago, but they haven't really been sort of lithified into hard rock. So they haven't been pressed, compressed or heated like normal rocks. So they're still very soft. And the one place you don't want to be is on Seymour Island in a dust storm, because it really is like being in Sahara. And there for scale is our camp. You can see those orange blobs. Those are our little orange tents. You can see by that fossil that I'm holding that this is a particularly good sequence for fossils. So what we find in these fossils, in these beds of rock, we find all the sea creatures, fossils of the sea creatures that lived on the sea floor at that time, which, not surprisingly. So we find things like these clams, we find lots of ammonites like these, we find lots of snails or gastropods, some of them with their original shelly material on. So when you get this out of the rock, out of the muddy rock, you can see the bright, shining, really jewel-like skin on these shell on these gastropods, and we can use this shelly material to work out the temperature of the seawater in the past in which these lived. The chemistry of the shell tells us about ancient sea temperatures, and we can tell from that the ocean was quite warm in the past where these creatures lived, probably about 15 degrees centigrade. So a very warm ocean and much warmer than now. So those are the creatures that lived on the bottom of the seafloor at that time. And I'm going to show you several reconstructions. I work with a series of artists to reconstruct what Antarctica looked like in the past, using all the scientific data and evidence that we collect from the fossils. So this is painted by Robert Nichols, who's an artist, particularly fantastic artist of dinosaurs. And this is our reconstruction of what the ocean would have looked like around the Antarctic Peninsula. This is about 70 million years ago. So you can see the background of high mountains that probably look like the Andes and would have been linked to the Andes at this point, although the Andes wouldn't have been there so high as they are now. And forested tree cover on the land. And then this large beast here, this is a marine reptile called a Mosasaur, about the size of a double-decker bus. And we found the whole skeletons of these creatures in the rock record, or in the sediment record on Seymour Island. We've got plesiosaurs, like this chap down here. They're primitive sharks, so we find imprints of the cartilaginous backbones of sharks. We see ammonites, there's an ammonite there. living in the ocean. You saw a picture of those. We have fossil fish, and we also have fossil birds as well. So we have the bones of birds in our sediments. And this chap here is a land dinosaur that was probably living in the forest and has floated out onto the ocean. So keep an eye out for him. He comes up later. Now, also in those marine sediments are fossil plants that have drifted out in the past. They drifted from those forests on the highland areas and were deposited in the oceans, in the mud at the bottom of the oceans, and fossilized. So we have a really fantastic collection of leaves up here. So this leaf here, about 2 centimeters long, is a very classic kind of leaf of what's called southern beech, or Nothofagus, its Latin name, which was very common in southern hemisphere forests in the past, and it is today. And this here is fossil wood. It looks like modern wood, but it's petrified wood. It's as hard as rock. And this represents large tree trunks that floated out from the forests on the peninsula 100 million years ago and became petrified as it was buried on the sea floor. And also in the sediments, we find all these small things here, which are pollen and spores and pollen from the plants that live there. So what we can do with all of this material is we can identify the types of plants that lived in those forests millions of years ago in Antarctica, but we can also use them to tell us what the climate was like, because in a simple way, we can just say, well, what kind of climate zones do they live in now? And what does that tell us about the past? Or we can do some very sophisticated climate modeling about the temperatures that the plants lived in. But essentially, these are the ancestors of modern southern hemisphere vegetation that grows now. So one thing to know is that northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere vegetation today are very, very different. The natives are very different. And in the past, they were quite distinct. And if you go somewhere like South America, Patagonia, or actually Tasmania is a great place to go, in the forests in the west of Tasmania, or New Zealand, you will see all the modern living equivalents of these fossils that I show you here. So it is quite a spectacular collection. And working again with Bob Nichols, this is a reconstruction, probably the most detailed reconstruction of a forest in Antarctica that you'll ever see. If you come to Bass in Cambridge, you'll see this on the wall. It's rather a large oil painting, and some of the fossils that were used to reconstruct it. This was work done by a PhD student called Jodie Howe, who worked on an island called Alexander Island, where a lot of these plants were preserved in place, in the places where they grew within the rocks. And so Jodie measured where they were, and we reconstructed this picture based on Jodie's measurements. So we've got here, this is a ginkgo tree, maidenhair tree, which is very common in the fossil record, and you may see it in a few gardens in the UK now. This you'll recognize as a monkey puzzle tree, very common in Antarctic forests and in ancient forests, fossil forests generally, but now living in the high Andes, on the volcanic lands of the high Andes. And here we have another southern hemisphere conifer. We have tree ferns, which are very distinctly living in Tasmania and New Zealand, normal ferns, some extinct plants, and a few bryophytes and mosses, but no flowering plants 100 million years ago. They hadn't yet evolved. So everything was conifers, ferns, and cycads. And hidden in here here's that dinosaur again, you can see. We're trying to find the bones of this little chap in this forest, but they do occur elsewhere in the southern hemisphere, particularly in Australia. And this is a small bird-like ornithopod dinosaur, probably about 9 meters long. We've definitely got the bones of it further up on the Antarctic Peninsula. And it was a herbivorous dinosaur, probably living off the vegetation in this forest. So there were a lot of animals around, and I'll show you some more dinosaurs in a moment. In fact, here. So this is a reconstruction, again, based on a lot of fossil evidence, that were fossil plants. I haven't got time to show you today, but this is painted by James Mackay from Leeds. And again, this is what we think Antarctica looked like a bit later on, so 70 million years ago. By that time, flowering evolved. And so you can see some red flowering plants here. These are Proteaceae or Proteas. There's lots of them in the supermarkets at the moment. I noticed them the other day, these big waxy flowers. They come over every now and then from South America and South Africa, and you can see them in the supermarkets at the moment. But they grew in Antarctica about 70 million years ago. And then these trees here are mostly southern beech. So these are flowering southern beech trees that were very, very common in these forests. And then you can just see on the high mountains, this kind of shapes of monkey puzzle trees, probably growing at high altitude. And there's some tree ferns. We have small sort of lily-like plants. We have gunnera, which you may know of from garden centres and in botanical gardens, and a rich flora now as we go through geological time. But this picture also has dinosaurs in it. So we did have a really good community of dinosaurs in Antarctica. And my Argentine and American colleagues worked on those bones. So we've got here, where's my pointer gone? In the distance here, hadrosaurs, and these large beasts here, sauropods. We have the big footprints of sauropods. We have Stegosaurus-like dinosaurs. We've got sort of something that's like a T-Rex here, and then these small feathered types. So quite a good community of dinosaurs living in Antarctica, now preserved as fossil skeletons and bones. Now, all of these creatures, of course, died out at the end of the Cretaceous period, about 66 million years ago. And Antarctica then changed, and its fauna changed. So this is a reconstruction by members of staff from the American Museum of Natural History, led by Ross McPhee, who painted this picture of Antarctica without dinosaurs, with new animals that emerged as the dinosaurs disappeared. So what you can see here is possums here, marsupial possums. He's on a branch of Nothofagus. So the plants didn't change. When the dinosaurs died out, the plants stayed the same in Antarctica, because you can see monkey puzzle trees here. There's big carnivorous birds, and these ungulates. There's a kind of primitive llama, if you like, or something like that. And actually, on the seashore, these little brown blobs down here on the seashore are actually penguins. And one of the unusual things is that we find a lot of penguin bones in the same levels of rocks that we find all the fossil leaves. So penguins evolved when Antarctica was warm, not when it was cold. So Antarctica was warm, but gradually through time, it did get a lot colder. Carbon dioxide levels were falling, and we think that's the reason why it actually became cold. But what really prompted Antarctica to become very cold was the change in ocean currents. So 40 million years ago, we see evidence of ice in the rock record. So that's a long time, 40 million years of evidence for ice sheets on Antarctica. And then what happened sometime later is that all the tectonic plates moved and the continents separated from Antarctica. So you can see on this diagram that Antarctica is now isolated from South America, from Africa, and from Australia, which it was once connected to as Gondwana. It's still a continent over the South Pole. It hasn't moved. It hasn't moved from 100 million years to today, still in the same place. But here you can see what happened about 20 million years ago was that due to that separation, the ocean around Antarctica could flow all the way around Antarctica without being blocked by any other continent. And that essentially trapped Antarctica in its sort of icy tomb as it wasn't allowing warm waters into Antarctica. And from then on, I think, was the time when the ice sheets really grew quite rapidly on Antarctica. That didn't actually destroy all the vegetation. For a long time, people thought that was it. No more plants on Antarctica from 40 million years ago. But actually, this is me looking very, very dirty. In the Transantarctic Mountains in the center of Antarctica, just a few hundred miles from the South Pole, And I'm holding a tiny, tiny little twig here. You can see there. It's probably about 10 million years old. It's mummified, so it's not really even turned to rock. And believe it or not, if you count the rings in a tiny, tiny little twig like that, there are over 100 rings. So these are the, if you like, the branches, twigs of tiny, tiny bushes that lived in Antarctica among the ice sheets, growing very, very slowly in the very cold glacial environments. But even so, those glaciers didn't quite reach very far from the South Pole. This is only 300 miles from the South Pole, where this site was when these little bushes were growing. But Antarctica was become quite cold at that time. And there are layers where we can see the leaves that were associated with these twigs, and you can see them up here on the top right. And by now you'll recognize them as Nothofagus, southern beech. So southern beech really hung on in Antarctica while it was really getting quite cold in sort of tundra-like environments. And then what happened is, well, that was the last, those are the last forests we find in Antarctica as fossils. And then there was this really quite fundamental change in Antarctica about 5 million years ago, sort of roughly 5 million years ago, when the ice sheets really set in, when Antarctica became very cold, when the ice sheets spread across the continent, and actually when ice started to form in the Arctic. So although there'd been ice sheets on Antarctica for 40 million years, the Arctic, because it's a big bowl of salt water, stayed relatively ice-free all that time. And it's about this time, a few million years ago, that the Arctic froze as well. And this is when the Earth became really cold, and we sort of set out into what we call the ice ages. From now on is the story when there are many people, I think, in the audience could take over from me, particularly people from Durham University who study the history of the Antarctic ice sheets. And I suggest that if in future, if you want to know the detail of this, you ask some of them, because they work on some of those big questions about how the ice sheets developed, waxed and waned in the last few million years. So the big questions really that I think a lot of people in Antarctic science are asking now, because this is what is going to affect us in the future, is as our climate warms, what is the big fate of the ice sheets and the ice in Antarctica? We already see some changes, and I'll talk a little bit about the research that's going on. Carving of ice shelves, just like this around here, is often quite natural. So the ice comes from the land as glaciers. It then flows out onto the edge of the continent, which is actually under here. This is quite flat. And then it forms sea ice. It forms an ice shelf, and then sea ice that freezes in the winter. And then it breaks up in the summer. This is near our Halley station, actually, on this area. And this is what, this is what Antarctica looks like today. This is in the Antarctic Peninsula region, the bit that sticks up towards Chile, South America. And it is actually one of the most spectacular regions in Antarctica, because the ice sheet on top of these mountains, it isn't too thick. And so the mountains stick up above it. So it really is quite amazing. On a good day, it's the most spectacular place I've ever seen. Down here, you can see our Rothera research station, which is the main UK's hub in Antarctica. So there's a runway there, and there are quite a few buildings down here. So if you go to Antarctica and fly down, say, South America or the Falklands, then you'll take the small Dash 7 aircraft and fly for about 5 hours to reach Rothera. And then from Rothera, then you can work in Rothera, or then take some of our smaller planes, the Twin Otters, to fly out into the continent for your field project, or go by ship. So it really is spectacular. So once the ice sheets have developed in Antarctica, then one of the things that many scientists want to know is, what is the history of those ice sheets? What what happened to them? How did they develop? How have they waxed and waned over time? And what can that tell us about the dynamics of the ice sheets and the response to climate change in the past, so that we can model the future and help predict what's going to happen in future? And again, the scientists from Durham are very good at this, and that's their speciality. So one of the ways of doing that is to drill cores into the ice sheet to see what it tells us about past ice history and past climate. So here's a large tent to set up for an ice sheet, an ice drilling mission. These are very large projects. They usually take 10 years or more to get funding, to set up, and then to actually do the drilling. And there's one that's actually sort of being planned right now in Antarctica called the Oldest Ice, to drill for the oldest ice. So you can see Rob Mulvaney here. He's very expert at drilling, right in the middle, and this is his drilling equipment. They kind of turn it on its end and it goes down into the ice, and they drill cores for hundreds, thousands of meters. And what they get is an ice core like this here. You can just about see this long rod of ice here, which they cut up into chunks, meter chunks. Then in the field, they put them in these insulated boxes and they fly them back to the lab. And what they do with them then is they can date these ice cores, and they cut them into thin slices so that they can understand what the historical climate history is in each slice. Oops. So what they get is these thin slices, which are quite remarkable. So what happens is, as the snow falls on Antarctica, it gradually buries itself and it becomes compressed, and the pressure turns the snow into ice and into very, very thick, solid ice. It's buried thousands of meters. But the air that was around when the snow fell is trapped in these little bubbles between the crystals of the ice. So you can see these little patterns on this circular area. These are little air bubbles. And inside those bubbles, there is the original air that was on Earth thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So the oldest ice that's been drilled so far is 800,000 years. And there are big projects at the moment to go back further to a million years, try and find million-year-old ice. So in those bubbles, there is ancient atmosphere, and it's the real atmosphere. It's not a substitute or a proxy. It's the real atmosphere that was on Earth thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So what the ice chemists do, the glaciologists, they take this back to their lab, they break the ice, they capture the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in these little bubbles, so they can then measure the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere hundreds of thousands of years ago. And in a nutshell, what they find is that while there was ice on Earth during these ice ages, carbon dioxide levels were never higher than about 300 parts per million. And of course, we know now that the carbon dioxide level is about 410. I think it's about 414 at the moment, parts per million. So there's one graph I'm going to show you, but this is a really, really important graph and quite famous now. So these are the results of ice core drilling back in 2007 from some ice cores that were drilled at that time. So I'll just go through them with you. So it starts, you can see there's a 0 here, that's sort of, well, that's 2007. And then as we go back, this is going back in time, back to 800,000 years. So this is actually drilling down in through the ice. And there are two curves on here, two wiggly lines. So this one is the temperature in the past. This is measured from the ice, the isotopic signature in the ice. And then this wiggly line here is the carbon dioxide levels that were recovered from the trapped air in those bubbles. Now, the first thing you can see is that they wiggle up and down, and both curves match. So temperature and concentration of CO2 matches. They are in tune with each other. And you can see that there's some irregular cycles of cold and warm, which are generally related to the distance of the sun from the Earth orbital cycles. But all in all, this is a record from the ice. So this is the temperature and carbon dioxide levels of Antarctica when there was an ice age on Earth. And you can see the most important thing to take away from this is that carbon dioxide levels never went above 300 parts per million all that time for 800,000 years when the glaciers were waxing and waning. So even though it may have got warmer, carbon dioxide levels never rose above 300 parts per million, and the ice never disappeared from Antarctica. But look where we are now. I mean, now we're at 400. I've had to put an extra line up here. We're over 414 parts per million. So we're way, way above that kind of stable waxing and waning of ice sheets. We're into a different kind of world. And to find out what a 400 parts per million world is, we'll have to look back into the rock record to see that. And you can ask me about that later if you like. I won't go into it now, but basically a lot of people are looking at the rock record now to find out what a 400 ppm CO2 world would look like, what did look like, and what it might look like in the future. So the big questions around Antarctica, actually in Antarctic science moment for the glaciologists who are working on the modern Antarctic environment, is about how the climate warming is affecting the Antarctic ice sheets. And in particular, what's happening at the junction between the warming oceans and the ice shelves. So this is a satellite image that was published some years ago, in which you can see, first of all, I'll introduce two ice sheets. So there are actually two ice sheets in Antarctica. This one here is called the East Antarctic Ice Sheet. And it's a big ice sheet, very thick in places, up to 4 kilometers thick, which is sitting on rock mostly. And so it's not really influenced by warm water at the edges, most of it. It's pretty stable at the moment, but I think this is where we need to watch next. But this piece of the ice sheet, this sort of thumb that sticks up on this side of Antarctica, is called the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. And this is where all the attention is at the moment, because it's this ice sheet which is most susceptible to global warming at the moment. And if all this ice sheet were to melt, it will give about 6 meters of global sea level rise, which will affect a lot of people living on coasts, a lot of coastal cities, and with quite dire consequences. In this image, what you can see are these red areas. And this is where the ice is melting, basically. It's where the ice is thinning. And it's particularly thinning along this coastline here, because what's happening is that the oceans are warming generally, their winds are changing, and the winds are bringing warm water down to here. And in particularly in this area here, the winds are actually bringing the water up underneath the ice shelves at the edge of the continent. So this is a really bizarre picture of Antarctica, but it shows beautifully the difference between the ice glaciers, if you like, and the ice streams off land that look like all these trees. So this is ice that's streaming down from the higher land into these big, flat, purple colored, false colored ice shelves. So the ice shelf is where all this ice reaches the ocean and it just floats like a shelf on the ocean water. And the really critical thing about these ice shelves is that they're like buttresses or doorstops. They're keeping back the ice that's on land. And the trouble is that if these ice shelves melt away, then all this ice on land will melt, will flow faster and flow into the ocean and melt, and that will cause global sea level rise. So the big question that scientists in Antarctica are trying to look at the moment is how stable are these ice shelves? And there's quite a lot of projects going on to look at particularly this ice shelf here, the Ross Ice Shelf, this one here, Ronnie Filchner Ice Shelf, and this particular one here, where that star is. Now, this is called the Thwaites Glacier, and it's quite a small, you can see it's quite a small ice shelf, but the really critical thing is that around the underneath this ice sheet here, the West Antarctic ice sheet here, there's no land. This ice is below sea level. So if warm water gets up here underneath this ice shelf, it has the potential to melt the heart out of the West Antarctic ice shelf. And climate modelers have shown that if you start melting the West Antarctic ice sheet here, it will melt, the whole thing will melt very rapidly. And so we really need to know what is going on here and how vulnerable this area is. So there is a big project. It's called the Thwaites Glacier Project. It's a joint UK-American science collaboration over 5 years, or now it's got to be extended because COVID has called a halt for a couple of years. But you can see it's a massive project which looks at many, many aspects of the Thwaites Glacier and the Thwaites Ice Shelf, and then the ocean around it. So there have been some marine cruises which have deployed a lot of instruments into the ocean, put moorings down to measure what's going on in the ocean. And in particular, they've used these autonomous vehicles. So they're like little gliders, little robots, and they've been sent underneath the ice shelf here to measure the water, to take pictures, to go right to this really critical area here where you can see the ice shelf, the glacier grounds onto the rock bed. And what we're really interested to know is this warming water going to melt that contact there? And if it does, then warm water will get underneath the ice shelf and then underneath the glacier and melt out the heart of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Now, this is quite revolutionary because up till now we've been able to take the ships right up to the edge of the ice, but we've never been able to go underneath the ice shelf. So it's this innovative design and engineering of these UAVs, the autonomous vehicles, which have allowed us to go and see what's underneath and what's happening underneath these ice shelves. So those projects have been done. So when COVID allows us to go back to Antarctica, we'll be working on the ice shelf, looking at what's going on there. And then there will be some also scientists working on the glacier itself in the field. They're also working on the rock around it to try and work out when the glacier was that high. There's lots of work going on in aircraft to do measurements through the ice, and satellite imagery as well to help understand what's happening to the ice. So it is a major, major project, one of the biggest field projects in Antarctica ever, but its results are going to be extremely important to try and understand what is actually happening to the ice shelf. So the ocean is really quite important. And again, I think this is the other area which there is a huge focus at the moment because it's absolutely critical our future. So here's a map of the oceans, and you can see Antarctica here. Antarctica is the source of really dense, cold, salty water that flows from Antarctica down into the bottom of the ocean. And it's the start of what we call the ocean conveyor. And the ocean conveyor, you can see here, it loops cold and warm water all the way from the South Pole, all the way up through into the high northern latitudes. And then you get warming currents coming back, flowing around. And this is what drives the transport of heat around the globe. So this ocean conveyor is absolutely critical in stabilizing our climate. So scientists really want to know what is happening to this deep water that's coming off Antarctica. Is it going to change in future? And what's happening to all these currents? And hopefully in future, they will be doing it on this. I hope you recognize the ship, the Sir David Attenborough, not Boaty McBoatface. And this is our new ship that's currently now launched. It was launched, was it last year or the year before? And is now doing sea trials. So it's sort of around the North Sea and into Norway. It's going to Norway soon. And it's been around the UK, just testing all the bits of the ship before it goes south to take us to Antarctica in November later this year. And it is absolutely chock full of the latest scientific equipment, right from the very bottom of the ship, from the hull, with sonars and acoustic specialist equipment on to look at swarms of krill or the nature of the seafloor, to laboratories. There's aquaria in here. There's all sorts of platforms for whale watching. But there's lots of chemistry labs in here for looking at atmospheric chemistry, ocean chemistry, the works. It's absolutely spectacular ship. And it's really needed because the ocean, particularly the Southern Ocean, is a really important feature in global warming. So I mentioned in the geological part that this, the pulling apart of the tectonic plates was quite critical in the generation of this current that trapped Antarctica in cold water. So here's some detailed work on that current, and you can see it's composed of a lot of little eddies, sort of lots of swirling masses of water that flows very fast and uninterrupted around Antarctica. And what with the strong winds as well, it's the most miserable place to be on a ship going across the Drake Passage. I absolutely hate it. I used to have to go to this part of the peninsula on a ship, HMS Endurance, and it was 3 days of hell, of seasickness on my bunk. But hopefully the Sir David Attenborough is a lot more stable. But what scientists have found when they've worked on this is that this ocean here these gyres are absolutely critical for pulling heat and carbon dioxide down from the atmosphere into the ocean. And they've estimated that about 36 degrees of heat that's been generated in our atmosphere by man-made warming has been pulled down into the ocean by these currents. So it's being stored in the ocean. This is a good thing. And it's also pulling down carbon dioxide as well, particularly the Southern Ocean. So we need to do a lot more work on this to understand where the heat is going and where the carbon dioxide is going. And, is it stable? Is it going to stay there? Or is it going to come back up into our atmosphere, which will cause even more warming? So there's a lot to know about what's going on there. And I have to mention all the animals as well. There's a lot of people working on conservation of animals around Antarctica, because as the climate warms, their specialist adaptations to this really cold environment is changing a lot. And we really need to know which ones are at risk, and if there's, how do we make some of them more sustainable? So there's work on the terrestrial environments. There's not many plants in Antarctica, but in the sub-Antarctic islands of South Georgia, there's some really rich faunas and floras. So there's a seafloor, or even in cold waters around Antarctica, there's a really rich shelly fauna. There's loads of starfish. There's lots of really amazing creatures. There's fish that have antifreeze instead of red blood cells in their veins so that they can survive in the cold waters. And then, of course, the penguins evolved in warmer climates, but they live in the cold, in the ice, and some of them breed there. There's seals. Whales are returning to the subantarctic islands after being slaughtered in the whaling industry up to the 60s, but now they are beginning to return. And then the albatross, which I'll show you. The critical animal, if you like, in the oceans are the krill here. So they feed off phytoplankton in the rich waters, particularly in the subantarctic. The krill then form these massive shoals that are then at the bottom of the food chain for many of these animals here. So they really are quite critical. And a lot of people are trying to understand, as the climate warms, what will be the impact on these really vital food chains. I mean, a lot of the krill, they actually breed in the sea ice. So if the sea ice is melting, then this will affect the krill and the amount of krill in the area, which will affect all the way up through the food chain. So they are quite fragile and susceptible to warming. this is a kind of area which is most fertile for the animals in Antarctica. So these are the sub-Antarctic islands. This is South Georgia. This particular island is called Bird Island. You can see that station there. There's a small station there. And most of the time it's not sunny. It's absolutely raining and murky because it's right in the middle of the ocean and it's pretty grey, but you can see how fertile it is. There's lots of grass here. And this is where the albatross live. So when you see David Attenborough on his program sitting amongst albatross, that's where he is. The BBC live here a lot filming the albatross. And on South Georgia, which is this island here, again, you can see, if you see David Attenborough sitting among millions of penguins, he's sitting on some of the bays here where there are a lot of penguins. And the penguins are there, the seals are there, the albatross are there, because there are a lot of fish around this area. There's lots of fishing fleet as well, which is a problem sometimes. But there's a lot of animals here that rely on that very rich food chain. And here you can see the albatross. The albatross are affected both by climate change, but also by the fishing around this area because they get caught in the fishing lines. So there's all kinds of things that are threatening these animals living in these quite extreme environments. So that takes us to present day, and I should just finish here. So I've given you a whistle-stop tour through 100 million years, from Antarctica when it was green, 50 million years ago, 100 million years ago with dinosaurs, to it beginning to cool as carbon dioxide levels dropped, and to tundra environments, and then into this frozen landscape of ice ages that we've been today. So we're trying to understand with science all of these different stages. And the big question is, we're here now, but as the climate warms, are we going backwards into a warm world? And will we lose these beautiful icebergs like this one here? Thank you.